So, yeah, thank you for coming. It's really lovely to have you join us today. My name is Deb Williams, and I work for Yorkshire and Humberside Asbestos Victim Support Group. I'm their bereavement and family support worker. Okay, if you want to get the next slide, Claire. Yeah, so I came in post last July, so nearly a year. So I'm not a veteran bereavement worker yet, but I'm working on it. So my background is actually, I've always worked with people, so I've always sort of been in health and well-being. I started off as an exercise specialist in the NHS, which I worked in mental health for nearly 7 years. And then I went into drug and alcohol work, which I did for 16 years with the NHS, and then I came into this post. So I've come with what I'd say is a lot of transferable skills. And during my year with, or near year with SARAG, it's been a learning journey for me. So hopefully that's what I'm going to share with you guys today. Okay, next slide. So just a quickie about SARAG. SARAG was sort of put together in, I think it was 1999, and it was with regards to industrial injuries from asbestos-related diseases. And the main thrust was for from benefits advisors to help with claims. So we have benefit advisors. We also signpost to expert panels with regards to solicitors that help with any claims for the work-related illness. And then we've got the emotional support, which is myself, and at the moment it's a lady called Wendy. She does the social groups for our clients, and I do bereavement and family support work. Okay, next slide. So I've named this talk today Sitting with Grief. And the reason being is because I thought that might reflect some of you guys in the facilitation of the groups that you do. And it may be that you've got somebody in your group that's newly bereaved, or maybe not newly bereaved, but dealing with bereavement and grief. And I think in my experience, it's often a sitting down thing that we do to help people along, and sitting and listening. So that's why I call it Sitting with Grief. And we're going to look at, briefly look at models of grief, the different types of losses, a little bit about active listening, some do's and some don'ts. Hopefully we can get a short video up by Brené Brown, which explains the difference between empathy versus sympathy. Going to have a quick look at myths of grief, and hopefully we've got some take-home points at the end. So let's see how we get on. Thanks, Claire. Okay, so to start with, the models of grief. So we're going to have a quick look at the whirlpool of grief, the dual diagnosis model of grief, Tonkin's model of grief, continuing bonds theory, the tasks of mourning, and 5 stages of grief. A lot of people here may well have heard of those models, so you might be aware of some of them, or you may not. Some may be familiar and some may not. So this one here is the whirlpool of grief. I've got to say that I did try and look who developed this model, and I couldn't find it, to be fair. But this picture I must accredit to Cruz, because it's one that was used in some of my training. But it's widely used, this this model. So what it depicts here is that we go sailing along in our nice river. Everything's nice and steady, and our lives are pretty okay, to be fair. And then we hit a waterfall, and that is the actual shock and devastation of losing somebody close to us, and that loss. So then we end up in the whirlpool, which is the whirlpool of grief. It's like the eddy in the water. And that's where all the emotions and reactions and even physical symptoms are all just a massive whirlpool due to this sudden loss. And, you know, it's where we can feel shock and numbness, feel really disorientated. We don't know what we're doing. It's where we don't sleep. And, you know, it's a really hard place to be. And sometimes we get up on the side of the rocks, and that's where we can feel physical pain and emotional pain there. Or you might get onto or feel washed up and broken down and sort of collapsed, where we've got sort of severe disorientation, and so we're sort of washed up on the side. And they are places that people go quite often, but we do need to get back into the eddy. We need to get back into the eddy so that we can come out on the other side and flow back down on the river. So in the eddy, it's where we look at our grief and touch into our grief, and it is the grief where we feel it's where the healing process actually is. And it is really difficult to get people to touch those places, to be honest. But grief is something that we need to go through. We can't avoid it, so that we can come out the other side and carry on our river, and where things get, you know, it's a new normal. Don't particularly like that word, but it is a new normal. It's where we build back up again. Okay, next slide. So this model is by Schrobe and Stutt, 1999, the dual process model of grief. I quite like this model. I quite like all the models, to be fair, but and you will find that you might dip in and out of different models if you're talking to people and kind of explaining where they may be at within their grief. So in this model, there's a loss orientation and also restoration orientation. So there's everyday life experiences, and basically with everyday life experiences after a bereavement, the pendulum swings between one and the other, and that is quite normal. And so it might be that one time you feeling really lost and not in control. And from experience, I've had people say that they actually feel like they're going mad, and they're denying the loss, and they're avoiding coming out of that feeling of huge sort of grief and going back into something that might get their life back on track. In the restoration, that is where you are trying to get your life back on track. Or it could be that you're actually avoiding grief as well. So it's where you're tending to like everyday life situations and doing things, maybe even distracting from your grief. It's also where you build up new roles, new identities, new relationships, and also where old relationships are developing into sort of newer relationships, because it might be the person that you've lost was very significant within that relationship with somebody else. So there's kind of a new perspective. So one is restoration and one is the loss. And for people to swing between both is absolutely normal. And you can do that within hours, you know, many times throughout the day. The problem starts with this model. Well, it's not with the model, but the problem starts with regards to if somebody gets stuck in any one side, to be honest. So if you sort of get stuck in restoration, it's where you're busy doing, you are, you know, getting stuck into life without the person that you've lost, building up new relations and sorting the house out, finances, whatever. And they all do need doing. But if you get stuck in that, you're not doing any grief work. And grief work is where the healing, you know, begins and gets you through. On the other hand, you could be stuck in your grief and not doing any of the restoration stuff, which means you're probably not even cooking for yourself, looking after yourself, and you're sort of in collapse and sort of denial. And again, if you get stuck, that is really hard, because you're not building a life around your loss. And often if people are sort of stuck in grief, that will be where we might call on some more professional help with regards to counselling. But you would look at somebody that's been stuck in grief probably for 6 months or longer and not really moving anywhere in their life. So to swing between the both is perfectly normal. Okay, next one, Claire. So this is Lois Tonkin's model of grief. Lois used to, she worked with people that were bereaved, and this actually came from a conversation that she had with a mum that had lost her child. And the mum was explaining to Lois about her grief. And she was saying that she personally felt that grief did not diminish. Grief was like the circle that you can see here. And to start with, it's all consuming. So it just consumes every part of your being at the beginning. And as life goes by, your life around the grief builds. And you end up getting, building new relationships, coping strategies, becoming a little bit more resilient. And so the life around grief grows and grows. But if you look in the picture, the grief itself is always the same. So that's how she described that to Tonkin. And she actually drew the picture of her grief as a circle. And sometimes this model is actually referred to as the fried egg model. So it's a bit like the grief is the yolk, and then the white sort of grows around it. So it's just, that's a slow process, and everybody's sort of journey is different. So that's the Tonkin's model of grief. So next one, Claire. So continuing bonds. So put this under model of grief. It's a theory, and this is by Class Silverman and Nickman. And they identify the need to continue relationships with the person that has died. And to be fair, I think continuing bonds happens naturally, although I'm sort of telling you about it now. I would say that most people will probably have continuing bonds, they just don't name it. And so that might be that you still continue to set the table for the person that's passed away, maybe, or you light a candle every night, or kiss a photo, you say good morning to the photo, say good night to the photo, or you may even talk to the dead person. You might plant a tree or set a little corner of your garden up where you might go and tend the garden and think about the person that's passed away. I personally know a person that still holds and wears a jumper of the deceased person. I've got several clients that still have the ashes of their loved one, and they have sort of little rituals of saying good morning, good night, or even chatting to them in the day if something's gone off. And so again, this is perfectly normal and natural, and it's really comforting. And as I said, it is something that people do without even thinking about it. That's what I've come across. And so the theory actually does remind us that sort of moving on and having closure with grief can actually be unhelpful and give us a sense of guilt that we're sort of leaving the person behind and forgetting about them. So the continuing bonds does actually help us as individuals that have lost people to cope and keep their memory alive. So next one, Claire. So the tests of mourning. So this is by Warden. I think it was 1999, I think. So I did write it down. Yeah. Oh, 1991, beg your pardon. And so the bereavement is what's happened, and grief is our emotions and our feelings, and the tests of sort of what we do to help us through. So if you can see, there's a little acronym at the side which says TEAR. And so Warden wrote down that is to accept the reality of the loss. So first and foremost is to accept the reality of the loss. And there is a lot of denial to start with, and that's when you're sort of in the eddy of the pool, if we were to go back to the whirlpool of grief. And so, getting to the acceptance of the loss is probably the initial thing that they do, and that's really hard because there's a lot of denial to start with, and so in that we experience and process the pain of death and grief. Again, that is difficult to get people to do because it's hard. They don't want to do it. They don't want to touch the pain. They don't want to touch the grief. It's really difficult. And to start with, a lot, people don't do that. And I think that actually helps people to do things that need doing to start with, as in arranging funerals, sorting finances. And in my experience through working with SARAG, if I get somebody referred to me, initially, they actually don't want my input. They don't want my help, my support. But further down the line, it might be a couple of months or a few months. People do come back to me and say, I'm ready now. I'm ready for a bit of support. And it's because they've sort of put everything at the side and just managed to function to get the sort of the practical things done. And then all of a sudden they are then faced with their grief. And that's where they sort of come on board. And that's quite common. So they adjust to life. Obviously, they're adjusting to life without the person. And then they're reinvesting in the new reality. So that's building your life, your resources, your resilience around your grief, which is a bit like, again, reflecting on the Tompkins model that we've just looked at. So this also, the task of grief, someone might be clearly doing one task at a particular time and skip another task. So whatever, it doesn't really necessarily go in any order. But I do, in my experience, I do believe that to start with, people are kind of in denial. It's hard to accept their reality, but that does allow them to get on and do the practicalities of sorting out funerals and such like. Next slide, please, Claire. Okay, it's 5 stages of grief. So this is probably the most well-known one. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So this model would take you through sort of 5 stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And originally it was actually set as a linear model. And the model actually was developed by Kubler-Ross when she was in palliative care. So it was actually what she noticed with regards to people that were dying, but it was sort of transferred onto sort of bereavement and grief. But sort of in later times, Kubler-Ross has acknowledged that these stages are not linear. They're not linear at all, and they can come in any order, and you don't necessarily go through all of the stages either. So there has become an acceptance of that. But the actual sort of stages, the anger and depression acceptance, they are experienced by bereaved individuals, and they're recognised as being the most experienced by the individuals. Okay, next slide. So this is just a quick overview of different types of loss. There's ambiguous loss, which is basically saying goodbye without leaving, but also leaving without goodbye, and situational goodbyes. So goodbye without leaving is sort of like a divorce or chronic illness like dementia, estrangement. Leaving without a goodbye would be, a person may have addiction that leads to abandonment, or it could be a missing person scenario. But also a child could feel this with a parent that leaves the family home, like due to divorce. And situational goodbyes are our future plans. So that might be down to financial or personal security going, a few disasters and political unrest. So they're sort of out of our control in that respect. Disenfranchised grief is sort of death of an ex-partner, death of an abuser, death of a patient, if it's somebody that we're working with, death of a pet, perinatal loss, elective abortion, or even loss of a body part. So we've got to remember that sort of grief isn't, although this talk is about bereavement as in a death, grief comes in many forms, doesn't it, of loss. So, but disenfranchised grief is yeah, it's quite common really. It's grief that's not recognised by other people. But it's as important as any other grief. I've got a client that's actually got an ex-partner that's a massive support to her, massive support. So if anything was to happen to him, it would be a huge loss to her. But in other people's eyes, it may well be a disenfranchised grief, and may not feel that important. So anticipatory grief, that's experience grief and emotions before the person actually dies or anything happens to them. So I work a lot with anticipatory grief with regards to my job, as well as actual bereavement. And that's because I support families where the dad, the mum, the partner's wife, husband is has a life-limiting illness, and so they don't actually necessarily want the support, but the loved ones do, and so they're already anticipating their loss, and so that's anticipatory grief. And the other one that I've got on here is loss by suicide, which is obviously a shocking loss, and lots of emotions come with that, with guilt and again rejection and all sorts, depending on whether the person that's suicide has left a note and the relationship with that person. So that, that's a really difficult one. This is not this isn't the full list, to be honest, but I've just put a few here. Next one, Claire. So just a little bit about active listening. So this is, I guess, is about sitting with grief, to be fair. So the biggest thing that you can do for anybody who is grieving is often just simply sitting with them and listening. And so a lot of my work, but the majority of my work is one-to-one work. I do a bit, I do some Zoom group work, and I do some face-to-face group work as well. But the majority of my work is actually one-to-one, and a lot of it's actually on the phone. I do offer WhatsApp and Zoom and FaceTime as well. That's pretty popular. So sort of sitting with grief is the listening part, and the feedback I get is phenomenal. It really is phenomenal about just being there, listening, being there for them, and allowing them to express, allowing your clients to express what it is that they're saying. But us as listeners, we need to acknowledge that we can't fix or cure grief. We can't make it go away, and grief is a normal part of bereavement. So if bereavement is the wound, grief is the inflammation and the pain. And inflammation and pain is part of healing, and it's the same with bereavement and grief. So the mourning itself is like the task that we do, which is going back to sort of the tasks of grief. So holding space and meeting them where they're at. So that's just accepting the person that you sat with, where they are, where they're at, and just sitting with them. So if you're face to face, you're sitting with them at the side of them, just quietly. It's not about, we always want to mend and fix, don't we? We're professionals and humans, and I think that's a natural, well, it's natural. I think it's where we come from. And it's why we do the work we do as well, whether you're volunteering or it's paid work or whatever. We want to be there and we want to make people feel okay. But we can't actually fix or cure. But believe it or not, you can make people feel okay and a lot better by just sitting with them. And so that's holding their space. And so you might use their language, and part of holding their space is summarising and reflecting as well what they've said. So they know that you've understood what they've spoken about. and by reflecting back, they know you're listening. So you nod and acknowledge and validate how they are feeling and how they're expressing themselves. So all of that is part of being fully present with a person and listen intently. At the bottom here, I put give cues of safety, neuroception. And neuroception is a word coined by Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, which I won't actually go into, but it's something that I'm really interested in. And neuroception is about how we give cues to each other without saying anything, basically. And so even here on the Zoom, you're looking at me and I'm looking at you guys, and we can already get a sense of how people are feeling. So I'm guessing you are already seeing that I'm nervous and trying to do this talk with you guys. And I'm hoping, as I'm glancing over, I'm hoping that you're looking looking at your screens. And so I know that hopefully you're interested. So that's what neuroception is. It's sort of the vibes that we give off without actually saying anything. And so that can be like just somebody sat beside you with regular gentle breathing. That gives the bereaved person a sense of safety. What bereavement gives people is they feel unsafe. They feel unsafe because what they're used to, their norm has disappeared. So somebody sat at the side or even on Zoom, you can see that they're relaxed, they've got gentle breathing, they smile, got a good posture. That gives a sense of relaxation, and that actually permeates and helps the person at the side if you feel the same way. Our speech also, with the tone and prosody, I can never say this word, prosodity of the voice, which is the intonation of emotion, again, gives rise to what the other person's experiencing. That's why if somebody's talking really fast and sort of in a high pitched, you can kind of feel that. It's like palpable, isn't it? Palpable. It makes you feel anxious yourself. So if you're sitting and listening, breathe gently, try and slow your words down and the length of the words. So the exhalation would be longer. So, you're slowing everything down, and it does actually help calm your client down, and it actually gives them a sense of safety. And so that allows them to speak openly and sort of willingly, and it just knows that you're there holding space for them, and that you're listening. Okay, next slide. Okay, some do's, and this is different for everybody from person to person. So do offer a compassionate presence. Now, I'm pausing because I was trying to actually look for the definition of compassion, because we're sort of getting embroiled with compassion and empathy and sympathy, to be fair. And compassion is more about being in somebody else's shoes, but sitting at the side of them at the same time. Because if you get too embroiled, if you sort of if you're an empathic, which is great to give empathy, but if you're empathic, it means that you could actually take on board, which we have to be careful of, take on board their pain, their sorrow. And if you're taking that actually on board inside yourself, that's then really hard to give those cues of safety, relaxation, and allowing them to open. I hope that makes sense. So compassion is being in somebody else's shoes, but at the side of them as such. So again, holding their space. I hope that makes sense. So do acknowledge their loss, say things like, I'm really sorry, I'm here for you. Do ask about their person that's died and listen while they tell the story. And they will tell you the story. Again, this is something I come across again and again and again. They do tell the story and they repeat their story, but it does help them come to terms with their loss. And this is where the part of sort of as retelling the story allows them to acknowledge and accept the death of their loved one. Okay. Do offer practical help if you can, and that all depends on your situation as a facilitator, or it could be somebody that's passed away in your own sort of life. So this all depends on where you are and who you're offering the help to. But even better, if you can, do offer something practical without being asked. So just as an example of this, a client of mine, a gentleman of mine who lost his wife to mesothelioma, he said the best help that he had with regards to that was that somebody knocked on his door and gave him, I think it was something like a hot pot for his tea, without even asking. And he was so grateful for that because he wasn't cooking for himself. He wasn't preparing anything for himself. And to be fair, if you ask somebody, oh, just I'm here for you, tell me what get in touch with me, tell me what you want, I'm here for you. That's really hard because they're sort of stuck in their whirlwind, in their eddy, and they can't think what they want. They can't think what they want, they can't think what they need. So just practical help, just to come up with it and say, here you are, is wonderful. And he said it was the best thing that he had. So also do stay connected, even when it feels difficult. And this means sort of emotionally connected, because again, we're not very good in the West, are we, with regards to bereavement and grief? Don't really talk about it. It's a bit of a taboo subject. So to stay connected with the person that is really upset and maybe crying is hard. So again, just take some slow breaths, long exhalations, and that sort of brings you down as the worker or the person that's supporting. And that then does help the person at the side of you as well. Okay. So like at the bottom here, if the person's crying, give them permission to cry. Say, it's okay, I'm comfortable with tears, or something like that. And just let them know that there's nothing wrong with it. It's all part of the healing process. Okay, next slide, Claire. So do's continue. So this is just sort of a bit of a list of sort of open questions or phrases that you could say. So what do you need? What do you need from me? What can I do to help? Now, again, these are open questions, so it might be a time factor where you would say this, because as I've just said on the last slide, sometimes it's easier just to do something if you're in that position, because people can't always think what they need and what might help. But so this might be further down the line in their bereavement journey. Okay. Again, it all depends on where you're supporting somebody. In my work, I support people from the beginning, sort of when they're in their eddy, when they're just falling over the waterfall, if you like, through to them sailing along in their new river. So, okay. So again, is there something else? And this might be, it might be like something that you even pick out for them. Again, it's a general question. So is there something else you might, it might be specific, like cancelling a direct debit for them, or actually making them something to eat, or signposting them. It could be anything. You could ask them what makes the situation difficult for you, and what makes it easier. So again, it's trying to use these questions to eke out how you can best help them. Okay, next slide, please. So here's some don'ts, okay? So don't use platitudes or euphemisms, unless they do. Having said that, I probably still wouldn't, but it depends how well you know the person, but you can do, okay? Don't use cliches, like I understand how you feel, you'll get over it, time heals, everything happens for a reason. God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Those they're not helpful, to be fair. So don't say things like I can't imagine, I don't know how you do it. If that was me, I'd do such and such a thing, or at least. Also don't say things like, oh, you look great, you look good today, you must be doing well, you're so strong. Focus on something, focusing on something positive, because it's a bit like toxic positivity, really. So you just need to be careful of that. Telling them to don't think of this and don't think of that. or even telling them that their loved one wouldn't want them to be sad. I mean, it might be that they say, well, actually, you wouldn't want me to do that. And that's okay to sort of acknowledge that with a nod or what have you. But that's if the client's saying that, that's fine. But, you know, it's not for us to be saying that. And also don't say, let me know if you need anything. As in, again, going back to what I said, as in preempting sort of the needs. Again, it depends where you're with the patient, client, and just see how well you know them and where they are in the sort of bereavement journey. So, but if you find yourself halfway through saying something doesn't feel right, just stop. Okay, no one's going to ask you to finish your sentence. And some things are okay for the bereaved person to say, but not necessarily for us. And again, you know, I was actually mentioned about the we've got a bereavement site on Facebook, and I said that it wasn't. To be fair, I said it wasn't very lively. Well, luckily, I did know the person quite well that I said it to, and it was a bereaved client, and she did start to laugh, and I was like, oh goodness, and she says. And I just said, oh gosh, I am sorry. I meant it wasn't very active. And she went, oh no, it's okay. It just made me laugh. But I did, you know, we do make mistakes. So I did apologize for that. But yeah, so next slide, I think, Claire. Okay. So this is a very short video by Brené Brown with respects to empathy versus sympathy, which I think is really, really good. And if we just play it, that'd be great. I think it's only a couple of minutes long.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so these are some myths of grief. The list isn't exhaustive. So women suffer more than men. The stages of grief are linear and they are the same for everyone, which they're not, which we did speak about. Grief is a sign of weakness. Time is a great healer. There's a right and a wrong way to grieve. Grief and mourning are the same. Grief as an endpoint. Okay, so just briefly, men and women, well, women don't suffer more than men. It's the fact that we maybe that we suffer differently. And again, to be fair, grief, the way we grieve will also depend on how, like, past traumas and such like. So it's how we cope. So lots of things can affect the way we grieve and how we travel through grief, and actually whether we get stuck in grief or not. And trauma and past traumas is actually a big thing and can be an indicator of somebody that will possibly get stuck in grief. And if that's the case, then it'd be for us to sort of signpost and see if they want to get any further help, like from people like Cruz or some other counselling service. I'm just going to skip back down to grief and mourning the same. As we said earlier, grief is sort of the pain and the emotions that we go through, but the mourning is sort of the tasks that help us get through that. And grief as an endpoint, well, it doesn't. It's a bit like the Tompkins model of grief. Grief stays the same. It's just our lives evolve around our grief, and so our coping becomes different and stronger, hopefully, and we become more resilient, and we build other kind of strategies and coping mechanisms around our grief. Okay, next slide. So here's some take-home points. So a bit like I said about counselling. So if you feel the bereaved person would benefit from having information about support services and going beyond basically what we can offer and our remit, do ask their permission and pass details on to, or pass them the details on about Cruz, Bereavement Care, or any other sort of charity or anybody that does bereavement sort of counselling. And just to say that not all counsellors do bereavement counselling or have actually had any bereavement training, to be fair. So it might be that, that you do specifically look for people that offer bereavement counselling, because not all counsellors have bereavement training. And I think the statistics are, because remembering that grief is a normal process. I think the statistics are about 20% of people that are grieving will need some kind of structured counselling help. Ordinarily, most people will grieve and will grieve in a way that's healthy. Let's put it that way. So accept everyone's grief in their own way. There is no normal way. So there's no time scale. We swing between different emotions. It comes like a wave, then it flows away. So it might just hit somebody and they'll say, "Oh, I don't know what happened. I just started crying." And this is normal. People think they're going mad, but it's absolutely normal. A lot of my clients say, "I feel like," they will actually say that, specifically say, "I feel like I'm going mad." And it's just a mixture of the whole, whole emotions just going around, and the thoughts, the processes, and it's really difficult for them, and that's why they feel the way they do. Okay, so offer comfort and reassurance without minimizing the loss. Accept that you can't make things better. And that's for us to do, because that'll make us feel easier with our clients and with the people that we're supporting, that we accept that we can't actually make it better practically. But being there listening does make people feel better, okay, by default. Okay, and encourage the person to talk if they want to. Okay, listen to them and tolerate silence. So this is difficult. This is something, well, difficult for us. We don't like silence, do we? But I can say through this, my practical experience, I do allow the silence, even if it feels a little bit awkward to me. And I don't think I've had anywhere where the person that I'm supporting hasn't, after a brief moment of silence, that might only be like 20 seconds, but it feels such a long time, then comes back and says something else. And so then you let them carry on with their journey. So don't be frightened of silence. It gives people space and time. Okay. Respect autonomy and offer choices where possible. And be familiar with your own feelings about death, grief, and loss, and offer empathy and not sympathy, which probably goes back to the video that we couldn't see. So do have a look at the video. But yeah, do be aware of your own feelings. Always check in with yourself. And if you know that you're going to be sitting with somebody who's grieving, it's always a good idea to try and check in with yourself and maybe do some slow breaths and just get yourself calmer. Okay, if you can. Next slide. So a little bit more, just the last one for the take-home points, which is defining grief. So the picture again, I did steal from Cruz, I think. So credit to Cruz. And so it's unique to the individual. So we've got the individual on the left, and the middle bit is basically how we want grief to work. We actually want it to be linear. We want to go from point A to point B. But the third picture is actually how it is, which looks like a big tangled up ball of wool. And that is how it is. And you just swing from one thing to another. But it's just about trying to support people as they do that. Okay. Right. So I just want to end with this, because this is a poem from Becky Hemsley. Now I have got specific permission from Becky to use any of her poems in any of the work I do. So I thought I'd put this in because it really does, I think it does reflect about how important it is to sit and listen. Okay, so I'm going to try and read this. I was never good at reading at school out loud, but anyway. It's called I'm Fine. So it said, today I said I'm fine. Not once, but 5 times altogether. When people asked, how are you? Then made small talk of the weather. And so I hid behind my mask, the one I'd worn a while. I set in place my bravest face and dressed it with a smile. And that was how the day went. All I'm fine and talk of rain, until somebody asked me how I was, then asked again. They asked if I was truly fine, and I said I was not, and they said they were sorry, that they couldn't do a lot. But then they sat beside me while I spoke the truth at last. They listened and they held me as the tears slipped through my mask. And where before I felt I should maintain this brave facade, I realised there was much to gain by letting down my guard. See, though my load was still the same, it now was not as heavy, because sitting and floating it had helped a bit already. Today they asked, how are you? And I told them I was fine, till someone saw behind the mask and asked me one more time. And though they may have felt that there was little they could do, they'll never know how much it meant to tell someone the truth. I really think that poem is all of my presentation, really, to be fair. It is about sitting and listening. It's so important. It really is so important. And that's the feedback I get is always, thank you for listening. A lot of people won't say half of what they might say to you, to their own family members and their close ones, because they don't want to be, they say that they don't want to upset them and they don't want to burden them and they don't want to feel weak or those sort of things, of the feedback that I get. And so you listening as an impartial person, but that can hold space for them. It's just massive. It really is massive. Okay, so next slide. So next slide, I've just put references, acknowledges to some of the websites and sort of people that have stolen things from, like pictures, like Cruise, Shapes of Grief. And then the last slide is any questions, but I'm unsure that we've got any time for any. And if I've run over, I do apologise. But I do thank you all for listening. They are my details, so you can always get back to me if you want to.